not true, because even when it comes to photography, it has a long, long history of manipulation. An interesting historical example is, Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union. He had an entire cottage industry that was dedicated to the manipulation of photographs, including using these craftsmen to kind of airbrush his pockmarked face to make him look more dictatorial, more regal, more of a authority. But also, interestingly, when he did the great purges of the 1930s, he would actually have people unpersoned or removed from photographs. So the manipulation of media has a long history. What's different is that technology is making it increasingly easy and democratizing it. And thus far, that's been true for photos, right? In 1990, when the Soviet Union fell, first kind of software to manipulate photographs, Photoshop, was released, and it's been 30 years since Photoshop has been around, and still you look at photographs and we still sometimes think, oh, the supermodel on the front of a magazine, that's really what she looks like, without realizing that that photo has probably been edited. What's different now is that we're starting to enter the era when film can be edited in the same way. Thus far, those kind of effects were almost exclusively in the domain of somebody with a lot of resources. So a Hollywood studio with multi-million-dollar budgets, or a huge team of special effects artists. But by the end of the decade, thanks to this thing called synthetic media, any YouTuber with no money, no special skill, no resources will be able to create something that is just as convincing or even more convincing than something that a Hollywood studio can make right now. And that's due to this revolution in synthetic media, that's AI-generated fake media, which is completely going to reshape our perception of the world and the media that we use to portray how that world should be perceived.
I mean, it's come in quite quickly. I mean, the techniques that are used, these AI techniques, generative adversarial networks and style GANs and so on, are perhaps 4 or 5 years old. I mean, they are from the second generation of the recent AI boom we've seen. That started in 2011, and the first GANs came out in 2014, and the performance has been improving very, very rapidly. I remember playing around with these in 2016, and it was quite amazing. But it was a little bit like when you may take a photo from a magazine and color in a moustache over the top when you're feeling a little bit bored, back in 2016. But it's really moved on a hell of a long way in terms of our ability to generate synthetic faces and increasingly synthetic videos.
Absolutely. The rate of change in the ability for AI to not only manipulate, but generate wholly synthetic media is exponential. It is really, really astonishing. And like so many things relating to deep learning, what really has happened over the last kind of 5 years is you've had this perfect storm where the mass availability of data and the ability of computers to churn it all has led to many practical applications for AI. And one of those applications, as you correctly mentioned, is the emergence only in the last 5 years of machine learning systems to be able to generate synthetic media after being trained on the right data set. And the really astonishing thing about this is that AI can be trained to generate very, very convincing fake humans. And a really powerful way to kind of look at how powerful this is to look at the website. For example, this person does not exist.
Absolutely.
Every time you refresh the page, you basically get a new face of a human that has actually been synthetically generated by AI. Now, that is only an image. The interesting thing about synthetic media is, of course, as it gets better, it's not only going to be in image form, it's also going to be in video form. It is also going to be synthetic text. It is also going to be audio. So the pace of change is very, very rapid. And that also means that it's already within the space of less than 5 years. It's becoming much more accessible. And we can probably talk about it later, but we've already seen widespread use cases of how this synthetic media can be deployed maliciously, but it's also starting to be wrapped up on things like smartphone apps. So almost in the next few months, I think you're going to see a boom in accessibility for this technology.
So you've mentioned one media media mention, which is of the website "This person does not exist," and I think after this this discussion, attendees should make that their second destination. Their first destination, of course, I should mention, is your book "Deepfakes and the Infocalypse." Infocalypse, what you urgently need to know, which is a great read. It's a short book, and I've read it, and it's available from your retailer of choice, and that should be your first visit after our discussion, and then you can go and check out The Fake People. So we understand the technology, and we'll talk about the relationship between proliferation and regulation, and how that makes a sort of a difficult set of policy choices a bit later on. Is this actually a threat, or do we have examples of synthetic media that has been used for nefarious purposes, which I think is what we, that's the inherent part of the word fake and deep fake?
I think that just like all great technologies, this is just an amplifier of human intention. So just as there are going to be many malicious use cases of synthetic media, it is also going to be used for a lot of good. There are a tremendous kind of potential for commercially viable applications of synthetic media. But again, because this field is so nascent, it's only in the last 5 years that AI has gotten sophisticated enough to actually not just classify, but generate fake content. We're only now beginning to kind of understand the taxonomy of this field. So in my book, I distinguish from the very, very onset that synthetic media writ large is not necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, you already start to see viable commercial applications in corporate communications, in fashion, in film. It's going to rewrite entire industries. But my interest, being somebody who works in disinformation and politics, is how this tool is going to be used as a weapon of mis and disinformation. Because for the last kind of 10 years, all of my work has illustrated to me that the information ecosystem itself is increasingly becoming corrupt and dangerous. And so I see the kind of malicious use of synthetic media as the latest evolving threat in an ecosystem which is already increasingly dangerous. So from the onset, let's distinguish that not all synthetic media will be used for bad, but deepfakes, which I term as their malicious use, are absolutely going to become one of the most powerful weapons of mis and disinformation known to mankind, not only because they are the most sophisticated tools that allow you to manipulate even film, but also because they're going to be accessible to anybody. So we have to think about how is that going to play out in this already corroding information ecosystem? Okay,
I'm going to challenge you on this question about whether it can be used for good. So if we have time, we're going to go back to that question, because I don't think it's as straightforward. I personally don't think it's as straightforward as that. But let's get into the meat of what synthetic media used in a disinformation context looks like. So we're already in quite a polluted infosphere as it is, and the amount of disinformation that has been flooding networks. I mean, we often think about what happened in the US in the 2016 elections. It was rather more prevalent in the 2020 elections, but it's happening in other parts of the world as well. Can you just give us a flavor, sort of level set, where the sort of pre-deepfake misinformation landscape was, and how serious it was becoming?
I think all of the kind of technologies of the exponential age, and I'm talking specifically about the internet, the social media, and smartphone, which really have only been around for 30 years, have completely transformed our information ecosystem. And I really put it in my book as this space, this environment, which all of us increasingly are connected in, that we live in, that affects everything from global politics to private business enterprise to even our most individual and private lives. About half of the world already exists in this information ecosystem, right? And for the past 10 years, we've seen all around the world how this information ecosystem, which when it was envisaged by its utopian founders, was kind of hailed as this unmitigated good for humanity, has a darker side as well. So the first thing I'd like to say is that over the past 10 years, for anybody who's been following kind of global politics, we've seen how this ecosystem has had very malign and malicious effects. The second point to make is that it is just at this moment when we're starting to kind of realize after the last decade of how dangerous this information ecosystem can be, that it is about to become far more potent, and that is to do with the evolution of AI-generated synthetic media. And the third point, getting to what you had opened with initially, is that the other half of the world, which doesn't yet exist in this ecosystem, is going to join in within the next kind of 5 to 10 years. And arguably, they're even less prepared for what they're going to find there than kind of those of us who are in the Western world are, because perhaps we have some defenses in our institutions. Perhaps we're more media literate. And I see this when I go back to Nepal. I'm half Nepalese, where people who, still have no access to sanitation and running water have a smartphone and internet access and are able to kind of plug into this ecosystem. And you see the effects of this playing out in places like in Nepal and India, where viral WhatsApp rumors are kind of leading to mob killings already. So it is a dangerous terra incognita, this information ecosystem. We've seen the dangerous implications play out over the past 10 years. And I think the other half of humanity that doesn't exist in this yet will be joining. So the question is, how do we defend against it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the way that you paint that picture is so critical, because the US, for example, has found itself very vulnerable to misinformation, despite being wealthy and well educated by any global standard. And as you rightly point out, the impact of WhatsApp and rumors of a very traditional type has led to murders on the street. Now, the challenge that we run into is the technology is highly proliferated. The devices are proliferated. The technology's knit together a bunch of different things. I mean, you have the AI, the synthetic generation of faces and then videos and events, but you also have the synthetic generation of text. You have technologies like GPT-3 that make it easier and easier to produce increasingly lifelike text, and you can knit them together. So it's not like a nuclear weapon, which is a state level endeavor. This is a kid in a bedroom on a smartphone level endeavor, or if it isn't today, it will be within a couple of years. So the question is, what do we do about it?
Oh, well, that's a big, big, big question. And I actually think it is one of the most critical, fundamental questions of our time. It is a challenge, in my view, that is just as important as climate change. How do we shore up the integrity of our information ecosystem? Because I think it's increasingly becoming clear that what is happening with the kind of exponential technologies of the information age is that we're entering a completely different paradigm. And I think that for the last decade or last 2 or 3 decades, we've been fairly lax in terms of beginning to understand some of the solutions in terms of shoring up that information ecosystem, but that is the critical thing that we need to do now. So in terms of what we do, I argue in my book that the first step is conceptualizing it as this ecosystem. And that's really what I do in my book, where I map out how this is playing out, not only in regard to geopolitics and the political sphere, but how it even affects us in our most private and personal lives. It affects every business enterprise as well. The second point I make is that this is becoming increasingly dangerous and potent to the extent where we're facing a future where all information is compromised. And there's a very interesting academic phenomenon which academics call censorship through noise. We've always kind of assumed that censorship is, we tend to more often think about it in terms of the North Korean model, where you have access to limited information. But when you are faced by an abundance of information, including bad information, which isn't filtered at all, it has the same effect, really. And we're starting to see that play out across the world. So when it comes to solutions broadly, I'll say, and we can discuss it in more detail, but there is no silver bullet solution.
Mhm.
It is about making our society more resilient in the faces of these exponential changes. I mean, it's actually just one tiny slice of the broader theme that you so eloquently discuss in your conversations and in the newsletter, because just as in the exponential age, everything you discuss is changing, so is our information ecosystem. What do we do about it? How do we shore it up? It takes a networked approach, but broadly, you can talk about technical solutions and human-led solutions with regards to shoring it up.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we talk about there not being a silver bullet. I've spoken to I spoke to the president of Estonia, and I spoke to the digital minister in Taiwan, and I've spoken to people in Finland. These are 3 countries that have put in place sort of human systems that relate somehow. We used to call it media literacy, but it's as much about media competency as anything else. So that, the first one of the early steps is, how do you equip your citizens with enough of a critical faculty to ask the right types of questions, so that they are a little bit inured to the risks of falling for a deep fake trap. I mean, that seems to be one thing that you can do. I mean, it's great because it sounds good on paper. Let's increase trust, education, and capacity within citizens. But that takes a long time. And what we have, of course, is this tidal wave of technology development approaching us. So yes, we're going to do that with citizens. It's a little bit like Custer's last stand. The relief may arrive after the battle is over. What do we do in the meantime? Should we look at technical solutions first, then we'll get to policy ones?
Well, I think that the technical solutions are already being built, specifically with deepfakes. When it comes, there's 2 ways you can think of the technical solutions. The first is detection technology. So basically building the AI to be able to detect manipulated media, because as the technology improves, the output, i.e. the synthetic media, is going to become so sophisticated and so convincing that to the naked human eye, it's virtually going to be indistinguishable from the real deal. So you're facing a future where synthetic media looks very convincing, exactly like the real deal. And because it is so easy to generate, it is going to be ubiquitous. So there's no way that human content moderators can sit there and pick it out. So you need to build the AI to detect it. There is a question mark about whether or not the detectors will always be able to outgun the generators. So as the detection AI becomes better, because of the kind of general adversarial network on which synthetic media is trained, the output, the generators also become better. So it's a cat and mouse game, open as to...
Well, I mean, I think we've got some lessons from Facebook, where Facebook uses a lot of machine learning to pre-moderate offensive material, and that essentially means that before a human moderator gets to it, the AI system sort of identifies it, flags it, and chucks it away. And they've done a very good job. They've gone from 20% automated removal to in the 90s, but that still means that over 1,000 times a day, really, really offensive material gets through on the Facebook network. And so a determined adversary will find it almost cheaper to, you called it sort of the idea of censorship through noise, to swamp systems. Even if I'm at 99.9% accuracy, if the adversary sends 1,000 items through, 1 will get through. If they send 1,000,000, 1,000 will get through. And so I think that that's not to say one shouldn't look at automated systems, but it is to recognize that it's an arms race that gets progressively harder. So that seems to be one technical solution. I'm curious about things like whether immutable timestamps on video and images could also be helpful. So the idea that perhaps at the moment that a film footage is taken, or a photo taken, it's immutably timestamped, perhaps in some distributed cryptographic way, so that we can go off and say, this is what the image looked like at the time at which it was taken. I mean, is that the sort of thing that people are talking about as well?
Yes, so both with the detection as well as media provenance, these are ideas that are now starting to come to fruition. It's only really in the last kind of 24 months that there have been concerted efforts to build the technology, both for detection, but also for provenance. Two initiatives come to mind. One is the Content Authenticity Initiative, which is led by Adobe with partners including the New York Times, Qualcomm, and Truepic. And already now, this year, they have basically launched the prototype for a phone or a device in where you basically embed into the hardware of the device authentication technology. So let's say you are a journalist or a human rights activist and you want to show that the media that you captured is authentic, then this kind of provenance technology will allow you to do that. And you can almost follow, like you correctly pointed out, throughout the life of that media, where it's been, how it's been manipulated, almost like a watermark to prove it's authentic.
Which segues neatly for our last 6 or 7 minutes into the questions of policy, because that touches the issues of what policies might look like, what human systems might look like. I've taken away the obvious one, which is let's teach people critical skills and increase trust in society. What else is there?
Well, that is such an important one, where people have to be critical, but be critical without becoming cynical. Because the other thing that we haven't discussed yet is kind of the flip side of synthetic media and the proliferation of AI-generated fakes that are so sophisticated that we can't tell whether it's real or not. And that is this thing called the liar's dividend. Because in a world where anything can be faked, right? Even video evidence, which we would have assumed was almost an extension of our own perception. That means that everything can suddenly be denied. And even before deepfakes become ubiquitous, I think the more pernicious short-term effect is this thing called the liar's dividend, where authentic media is going to be decried as deepfake or fake media. We've already seen real-world examples of this, including in Gabon, where there was a failed coup d'etat because basically the incapacitated president who had had a stroke appeared on TV and he looked strange, and basically his political enemies said that it wasn't him, it was a deep fake, which led to a coup d'etat. So the liar's dividend is very, very pernicious. And I think, again, just going back to this, we have to become critical without becoming cynical. How do we do this? Well, education policy has to be rethought.
I had a question about whether this is a sort of thing which could, the bit that's difficult for me is that we could enforce this on the distribution networks, right? We could say to a Facebook or a WhatsApp or a TikTok, you're going to carry the liability for putting deep fakes on. So you make whatever changes you need to fingerprint content or users and to attenuate things that look like they're fake. So one could do that. The problem that you then get into are the legitimate uses of this technology. So of course we know that, for example, with the Rohingya Muslims who faced a genocide that was run by the state and sort of accelerated by Facebook, that activists and the Rohingya themselves at great personal risk were able to smuggle out photographs of what was going on, and we were able to provenance them because of the charities and the NGOs involved. Had they had chips in them that were timestamping them, these are the types of things that authorities can turn into authoritarian tools. So it strikes me that that balance between the policy dimension for protecting against deepfakes and the technology edge also runs counter to some of the benefits of having a free and open information ecosystem.
Absolutely. It is the human side of the problem. So we can the technical solutions can be built, but the human side, how do we apply them? This is really where the debate needs to be had now. You mentioned that, we could put the onus on social media companies to make sure that, all kind of deepfake content is removed. But even before we start talking about deepfakes, what's already done a tremendous amount of damage, and you mentioned the case of the Rohingya, is cheap fakes, which are the kind of predecessor to deepfakes in the sense that they're not manipulated by AI, but it's photos and videos that are either crudely edited or taken out of context, as happened with the case of the Rohingya, which in the real world have literally helped to incite genocide. Who how do you start to get social media companies to take down all kind of images and media content? We've already seen how the social media companies have been taking a far more proactive stance vis-a-vis COVID and the US election. But the effect that seems to be having is increasing this narrative of censorship, right? And if my suspicion is that if the kind of big traditional social media companies start cracking down on all cases of media or manipulated media, using their own judgment on in which cases it's allowed and in which case it isn't allowed, is that people will start migrating to other platforms, which is indeed what they've already started to do. So I think the onus is not only on social media platforms. The problem, however, and you talked about Estonia, Estonia is a society where they've been able to deal with inoculating the public against bad information, disinformation fairly, really successfully. The problem comes in more diverse societies like the US or even the UK, where, even the leaders like Donald Trump himself are pushing disinformation because it's a narrative that shores up his own power. So I think it's a really, really complicated, convoluted conversation that we need to be having now.
Now, Nina, I know this is all live and we originally asked for you for 30 minutes, but I'm quite enjoying this. So do you have a few more minutes to give us?
I do.
Okay, well, hopefully our attendees can also stick with us. So I want to, I think there's something quite interesting around, I'll go back to this point about, I think one challenge that we have, of course, is that a resistance against regulating deepfakes at any governmental level is that it's a rather useful tool for national security. It's quite a cheap way of fiddling with your international rivals. You don't have to send in the SAS or SEAL Team 6 or drop a cruise missile, which kind of tends to be expensive, puts your young sons and daughters at risk, or blows up the wrong building. It's quite nice if you're running the cyber offensive capabilities that now exist, even in democracies, to be able to use deep fakes as well. So there is some, there's also this national security tension between not wanting to plug the vulnerabilities because it gives you a relative advantage over your rivals. I mean, is that a real consideration?
I think it is a consideration. I mean, when I first came to deepfakes at the end of 2017, when they actually emerged on Reddit in the form of non-consensual pornography, I was advising the former NATO Secretary General, the only concerted effort that we knew of to try and detect but also learn more about synthetic media was being run by DARPA, right? The US military. Broadly speaking, and you've had some very interesting conversations. I'm thinking of one with Richard Barons run the UK Armed Forces, is that in the 21st century, the way that we understand war is radically changing, and war in this information space is increasingly going to be the way that war is waged, but not only between nation states, right? The democratization of this technology in this information ecosystem means that even non-state actors, organized groups like ISIS, but even lone individuals have tremendous power. And I think this is really getting back to why this is such a paradigm change, because it even affects it not only affects how we communicate and perceive the world, but it affects the future of warfare as well. The other point I'd make about regulating deepfakes, and there are places in the world where they've now passed legislation. For example, in Texas and in California, it is illegal to use the deepfake ahead of an election. Is that actually the dangerous path that you set is that you, by passing a law where you say deepfakes are outlawed, somebody has the authority to decide what is or isn't a deepfake. Very interesting, because the other country where deepfakes are banned is in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that said, there is something about the norms that start to get established, which often govern our world as well. And at the moment, it feels like there aren't really very good norms around around deepfakes. You know, we might see, and that's partly also because you know, deepfakes cross over with parody and satire. You know, is you know, Saturday Night Live, when they're making fun of the American administration, that's sort of like a low quality fake because we know what it is, but we're laughing at it. And there is a boundary. But I do wonder about whether the efforts to construct some common values around particular technologies and having professionals saying, you know, we're not going to use them. And I think we started to see this a little in the fashion industry, where certain magazines started to say, we're going to limit our photo manipulation.
Yeah.
Pardon me, I left my Slack on by accident and it's going crazy. We're going to, you know, we're going to voluntarily not manipulate the photos of models beyond a particular degree. And I wonder whether norms like that can be part of a code of conduct, which means that that the arrival of any kind of deep fake stands out a little bit, and can be seen as something that's not behavior that we want to encourage.
I think that's a great question, and you're absolutely right that this is the time to set the norm, define the standards, talk about how synthetic media should be labeled, because we still have a window to do it. This technology is still so nascent. Remember, it's only less than 5 years old. The real world application is coming quickly. People who I spoke to when I was researching my book, people who were working on the generative side of creating synthetic media, one of them told me that he thinks that in about 5 to 7 years' time, 90% of video content online is going to be synthetic. So we have a short window. And what I think is very encouraging, actually, is, although I look at the deepfake issue from the perspective of how it can be used as a weapon, there is, of course, there's a huge community of startups and AI researchers who are working on developing the generative technology. And so many of them have reached out to me to talk about exactly this. How do we set the norms? You know, what are the ethical standards? I've been seeing a lot of proactive thinking from industry on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel to me that, you know, starting to take certain types of steps. So, for example, having anything that is synthetic, agreeing that it ought to label itself as synthetic, and we can expect that ask that of robots and chatbots. And I've noticed a slight shift in the sort of those text chatbots that you now see. When you go to a website, a few years ago, they would all give themselves names, and increasingly now they say, I'm a bot designed to help you, and I'm about to pass you on to a human. Those are little things that one can do that establish themselves as norms. And what's interesting, I think, is that in doing that, you force anyone who cheats that to take an additional step. And we've got an example of this in aviation. There's something called the IFF transponder, the identify friend or foe, and you're meant to have that transponder, and it bleeps out and says, listen, I'm going to show my age, I'm a Pan Am civilian airliner, or it bleeps out and says, I'm part of the Iraqi Air Force. And in general, people have adhered, militaries, even during combat, have adhered to using their IFF transponders, and it's seen as quite a no-no, quite an escalatory and aggressive measure to go off and breach that norm and breach that convention. I do wonder if we started to establish around anything that was synthetic, anything that was non-human, that doesn't really have agency, that is faking that agency, faking its provenance, has to identify itself as such, that ends up being quite a nice, not perfect, but quite a nice break on some of the risks.
Absolutely. And I think at the heart of this, I mean, I broached this topic, but it's so vast. You know, I broached it in terms of the corroding information ecosystem, mis and disinformation. But if you broaden out the topic, it's at its heart a deeply philosophical question about to what extent should any human communication or any human interaction be organic or synthetic? And is it the case that all human interaction, should some forms of human interaction only be reserved as being organic, because I think aside from kind of the obvious malicious use cases of deepfakes, some of the commercially viable applications are going to see, people already use things like Instagram filters. People are building digital avatars.
Mm-hmm.
There is a company called Pinscreen. I, very much like kind of the CEO who is putting all of these synthetic media technologies to use to create entirely synthetic humans. That's the next step. Right now, we're talking about synthetic pieces of media, but we're now coming to the stage where we're going to have entirely synthetic humans, but also use synthetic media to present ourselves to the world. So it is, like you mentioned, it is a deeply philosophical question, but if we were to set the norm that all synthetic media should be labeled as such, this is the time to do it, I wonder if the wide-scale application will happen fast enough to keep in pace with the evolution of the technology.
I wonder that as well. Nina, it's been great to have you chat with us. Let's just run through a couple of things. Number one, tell us about your book, and number two, your Twitter handle, so people can follow you if they want to, which I recommend they do.
Thank you. So it's Nina D. Schick on Twitter, and my book, you can look it up on Amazon, Deepfakes. It is out in the US, the UK, and various other parts of the world as well.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to talk to you, and to all of our attendees, thanks for giving us so much of your Friday afternoon. Thanks. Bye-bye.